Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a pretty fascinating case, a cold case from way back in 1977 in Honolulu. We're looking at the murder of Dawn Momohara, a student at McKinley High School. And what makes this case so interesting, well, it was finally solved after nearly 50 years, thanks to advancements in DNA technology. The thing is, back then, investigators just didn't have access to these tools.
Yeah, this case is kind of mind-blowing. It really makes you think about just how far forensic science has come and how it can completely change the game when it comes to solving these mysteries, even decades later. So let's set the scene. It's a seemingly ordinary Monday morning at McKinley High. A teacher is going about their day when they stumble upon a horrifying discovery. On the second floor of the English building, they find Dawn's body. She was only 16 years old. And the details, well, they're pretty disturbing. Dawn was partially clothed, there were signs of a struggle, and an orange cloth was found tightly knotted around her neck. The evidence pointed to sexual assault and strangulation. It's a horrible tragedy.
Can you imagine the shockwaves it must have sent through the school? Through the entire community, even? Absolutely. I mean, this was way more than just a crime. It was a loss of innocence for Honolulu. Back then, Honolulu had this reputation of being a safe, close-knit community. And then this happens, it really shook people to their core. It really did. We actually have some insights from someone who was there, someone who experienced this firsthand. Susie Chun Oakland, she was a student at McKinley High at the time. She talked about how this case was a real turning point for Honolulu, how it was a stark reminder that vulnerability can exist even in a place that feels like paradise. It makes you realize that these events, these crimes, they don't just impact the immediate victims and their families. The effects ripple outwards. They change the entire community's sense of security. So let's talk about the investigation. What did the police do? They launched an investigation, of course, and they did the best they could with what they had at the time. They conducted a lot of interviews, countless, really, including one with a recent graduate named Gideon Castro, who admitted to knowing Dawn. They circulated sketches, based on what eyewitnesses could remember. They diligently pursued every single lead. But despite all their efforts, the case eventually went cold. That's got to be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved, To have this horrific crime hanging over their heads, unresolved for years and years, absolutely. Decades passed with no real answers. And Dawn's family and friends were left with this pain, this void of unanswered questions. But then something interesting happened. In 2019, the case takes a really dramatic turn. Cold case detectives, armed with this advanced DNA technology that simply didn't exist back in the 70s, they decided to reopen Dawn's case. Now, this is where the deep dive really begins. It's not just about dusting off some old files. It's a whole new level of investigation. Exactly. It's like a brand new chapter in the stories being written, and it's all thanks to science. So they had evidence from the original crime scene, right? Including clothing that belonged to Dawn. What did they do with that? Well, they carefully analyzed every piece of evidence, and in 2020, they managed to extract something amazing, a partial DNA profile of an unidentified male. Okay, so think of it like this. They found a single puzzle piece. It was a clue, for sure, but not the complete picture. They still had a long way to go. All right, so they have this partial DNA profile, but after all these years, how on earth do they connect that to a suspect? I mean, it's not like they could just run it through some database and get a name, right? You're right, it's definitely not that simple. They needed more. And that's where familial DNA searching comes into play. So in 2023, investigators received new information, and this information pointed to Gideon Castro and his brother. Remember, Gideon had already been interviewed back in '77. They were considered persons of interest, but the investigation hadn't gone anywhere. So what did they do with this new information? This is where it gets really interesting. They managed to obtain DNA samples from the children of both brothers. Now, here's where the science comes in. A child's DNA, it's a mix of their parents' DNA, right? So by analyzing these children's DNA, they could essentially try to reconstruct pieces of their father's genetic code. They needed enough to see if there was a match to the evidence from the crime scene. It's like finding a fingerprint, but instead of it being from your finger, it's from your family tree. That's incredible. It really is. So what happened? Did they find a match? They did. One brother was quickly ruled out, but the DNA from Gideon's son, well, it matched the profile from Dawn's clothing. Talk about a breakthrough. After 46 years, they finally had a solid lead. I mean, it's incredible to think that a case this old could be solved because of scientific advancements. Absolutely. So what did the police do next? They had their prime suspect, but he was decades older now, and they had no idea where he was living. The detectives, they weren't going to let this go. They were determined to finally get justice for Dawn after all these years. They tracked Gideon down, and get this, they found him living in a nursing home all the way in Utah. They got a DNA sample directly from him. And, well, the results confirmed what they suspected all along. It was a match.
Gideon's DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene. Can you believe that? After 46 long years, they finally had their guy. Gideon Castro, now 66 years old, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. It's almost impossible to imagine what everyone involved must have been feeling at that moment. I mean, for Dawn's family and loved ones, it must have been such a bittersweet moment. Relief that they finally had some closure, but also this overwhelming sadness that it took so long.
Absolutely. And for the detectives, I can only imagine the feeling of accomplishment, after all that time, all that work. But also probably this heavy weight knowing the tragedy that had happened and all those years that had passed without answers. It's hard to even fathom. Do we know how people who were originally affected by the case reacted to the news? What about Susie Chun Oakland, being a student at McKinley High when it all happened? What was her reaction? Her reaction was really powerful, really poignant. She talked about feeling this sense of relief that the case was finally solved, but also this deep, lingering sadness for Dawn, for the future that was stolen from her. She talked about the Hawaiian concept of kupuna, which means elders, the wisdom that elders carry. And she said it was just heartbreaking that Dawn, who was only 16 when her life was cut short, would never get to become a kupuna herself.
She'd never have the chance to share her own wisdom with the world. It's just a stark reminder of the ripple effects of a crime like this, how it continues to affect people decades later. It goes way beyond just solving a puzzle, It's about real lives that were forever changed by this horrible event. And it makes you think about justice, Even when it's delayed, it can still provide some sense of closure. It's a step toward healing, even after all these years. It really is. This case is a powerful testament to everyone who never gave up, especially the investigators who were dedicated to finding answers for Dawn and her family. But it also brings up so many questions, especially about the role of DNA technology in our justice system today. Absolutely. This case is like a window into the evolution of forensic science. Back in the 70s, DNA technology was just in its infancy. Now it's like having a microscopic detective at every crime scene.
All right.
It's not just about identifying suspects anymore. It's about revisiting old evidence with this fresh perspective. And for families who thought they'd never get answers, it offers a glimmer of hope.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you wonder, what's next?
Could this technology actually help prevent crimes from happening in the first place? That's a fascinating question. Think about the potential of DNA databases, not just to solve crimes after they happen, but maybe to deter potential criminals, or even to identify individuals who might be at risk of getting involved in criminal activity. That's taking things to a whole other level. It is. But I can see how this kind of thinking comes out of a case like this. One breakthrough can lead to a whole cascade of possibilities, and of course, new ethical considerations that come along with those possibilities. You're absolutely right. It's a very complex issue with no easy answers. How do we balance the potential benefits of this technology with the right to individual privacy? These are questions that we as a society need to really grapple with as DNA technology continues to advance. There's no doubt about it. But one thing's for sure, the story of Dawn Momohara's case is powerful. It reminds us that even when things seem the darkest, there's always hope. Hope for answers, hope for closure, and maybe even hope for a better future. It's a story that stays with you.
And I think it's a perfect example of why we do these deep dives. You take a seemingly isolated event, this tragic murder in Honolulu, and all of a sudden we're exploring the evolution of forensic science, the ethical dilemmas of DNA technology. We're even talking about the very concept of justice itself. It's all connected, isn't it? And that's what makes it so fascinating. We start with one case, and it opens up this whole universe of questions, of possibilities. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing how one story can lead to so many other ideas, and I think that's what's so great about these deep dives. We begin with this single story, and it just sort of blossoms into something so much bigger, something that touches all these different parts of our lives.
Exactly. This case isn't just about Dawn Momohara. As heartbreaking as her story is, it's also about something bigger. It's about the power of science, uncover the truth, and about the complexities of our justice system, and the ethical questions we have to face as technology just keeps advancing. It really does make you think,
about all those other cold cases that are still out there, all those families who are still waiting for answers. And what about the future? What happens then? How will DNA technology keep shaping our world, for better or for worse? Those are questions we all have to think about. I think this case is the perfect place to start that conversation. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what really stuck with you? What are your thoughts on the power of DNA technology? Does it give you hope? Or does it make you a little worried? We always love to hear from you, so feel free to share your thoughts on this case. Keep those conversations going. In the meantime, stay curious, keep exploring. Until next time.